March 12, 1978. 02:17 a.m., local time, Western Military District, USSR, inside a dimly lit radar control bunker near the Polish border. The night shift had been routine until it wasn't. The operator monitoring grid sector 6B watched as his screen lit up like a Christmas tree. 1 contact, then 5, then 23. Altitude 11,000 meters. Speed Mach 0.8, spaced evenly. Heading east, bombers, at least 30 of them. The room erupted. Phones rang. Alerts were triggered. The PVO Soviet Air Defense Forces moved to full alert. These weren't random radar blips. They were flying in a tight formation, coordinated, intentional, possible U.S. strategic incursion, barked the shift commander. SAM batteries in Belarus were brought online. MiG-25 interceptors scrambled from Smolensk. Orders flowed up the chain toward Central Command in Moscow. The assumption was simple and terrifying. This was not an exercise. The radar signals were clean, strong, no jamming, no fading, just unmistakable signatures of fast-moving, high-altitude aircraft moving straight toward critical Soviet airspace. But there was one problem. When the first MiG-25 screamed toward the blips, radar guided them perfectly into intercept range. The sky was empty. The pilot saw nothing, no contrails, no aircraft lights, no shadows, just black sky and clouds. Yet the ground crews insisted radar was tracking targets. Multiple, confirmed, locked. The radar saw bombers, yet the pilot saw nothing. Then another layer of confusion. Ground-based radar at Kaliningrad began reporting targets, where there were none just moments earlier, dozens more. The system now showed nearly 60 hostile aircraft, appearing and disappearing like phantoms, and still, not a single visual confirmation. At 03:41 a.m., after 4 hours of pursuit, one commander radioed back, "We're chasing ghosts." But the system said otherwise. This wasn't jamming. It wasn't a drill. The entire Western defense net was reacting to a sky full of threats that didn't exist. Something had turned the Soviet Union's most advanced radar network into a machine hallucinating war. And no one knew why. To the Soviet Air Defense Forces. Radar wasn't just a tool, it was truth. In a world where pilots could lie, transponders could fail, and intelligence could be faked, radar was the one voice that never blinked. It was the invisible shield that stretched across the western frontier, reaching deep into the night sky, watching everything. Or so they believed, from the lowest SAM operator to the highest PVO general. One assumption bound the entire system together if the radar showed a target. That target was real. This was not superstition. It was state doctrine. Soviet radar had long been praised for its precision. Decades of military engineering had produced multi-frequency detection arrays capable of spotting a B-52 at 400 kilometers. Anti-aircraft divisions were trained to respond in seconds. Delays meant death, doubt meant defeat, and so the radar screens became sacred. In training, operators were drilled to trust the machine. If it moves, track it. If it enters your zone, target it. If it's hostile, destroy it. But that training came with a flaw it never considered, that the radar might be wrong without being broken. No doctrine accounted for ghost returns. No manuals explained anomalous propagation. Weather, it was logged, but rarely factored. The assumption was that Soviet systems were too advanced to be fooled by atmosphere. That night, when the skies filled with phantom aircraft, officers assumed the impossible had occurred. A U.S. bomber fleet had penetrated the border undetected. NATO was executing an electronic warfare attack. A first strike was being staged. They didn't ask, is the radar malfunctioning? Because the radar wasn't, it was working exactly as designed. It was bouncing signals off the upper atmosphere and painting reflections from distant terrain, scattered cloud, and thermal boundaries. The system was not broken. It was simply seeing too much. But in a world built on absolute data, that nuance was deadly. Back in the control bunker, junior officers asked why the MiG pilots saw nothing. Senior commanders dismissed it as enemy stealth or sensor lag. The truth that the radar was being deceived by physics itself was unthinkable, because the system could not be wrong. And if it was, then everything the Soviet Union believed about its own air defense dominance would begin to collapse. The Soviet air defense doctrine was forged under a singular belief that the only thing standing between the motherland and annihilation was response speed. Every radar signal, every alert, every scrambled fighter and armed missile site was part of a tightly choreographed ballet. A ballet that began with blips ex threat. PVO Strany. The branch tasked with defending Soviet airspace was designed to act, not question. Its structure demanded obedience to systems, not interpretation of anomalies. There was no clause in the doctrine for maybe. In a Cold War where nuclear-tipped bombers could cross borders in minutes, hesitation was suicide. And so, the radar was given ultimate authority. If a target was detected, the following sequence triggered classification in speed: altitude, trajectory, correlation check for IFF codes or known flight plans, escalation if unidentified, escalate to alert, engagement track, intercept, or destroy. But this chain of logic depended on a single idea that what radar sees is always real. It made sense in theory. Radar was precise. Soviet engineering had optimized these systems to handle terrain, altitude shifts, and speed anomalies. What the doctrine didn't account for, what it refused to account for, was the rare but catastrophic phenomenon of ducting. Atmospheric ducting occurs when a temperature inversion, cold air trapped beneath warm air, bends radar signals beyond their intended path. Instead of traveling straight, the radar waves curve with the atmosphere, bounce off distant objects or layers of humidity, and return with perfectly believable false readings. This was not science fiction. It was basic meteorology. But the Soviet military had deemed it irrelevant, too rare, too complex, too unworthy of doctrine. And so, on the night when clouds aligned just right, and a thermal inversion turned the skies into mirrors, the system saw enemies that didn't exist. And, true to doctrine, it prepared to fire. The interceptors launched, the missile crews readied warheads, and the radar operators watched the sky full of ghosts, believing they were watching an invasion. Had one commander given the order to launch a SAM, had one pilot mistaken a radar lock for a visual confirmation, had one political officer decided this was a NATO feint, the Cold War could have gone hot over vapor. That night, the doctrine didn't bend, it cracked, because it couldn't tell the difference between a threat and a trick of the air. At precisely 00216, a radar station near Brest, Belarus reported the first anomaly, a tight formation of fast-moving aircraft approaching from the west. Seconds later, stations in Grodno and Kaliningrad echoed the same signal, each confirming dozens of inbound targets at high altitude, low thermal signature, and consistent spacing. It looked like a strategic bomber wave, a classic first strike profile. Within minutes, over 30 targets had been tracked. Their paths were coherent. Their speeds matched real-world aircraft performance. Every data point screamed enemy incursion. And yet, no visual confirmation, no IFF response, no engine noise. Still, the system responded as trained. Surface-to-air missile crews near Minsk were placed on full combat alert. MiG-25 squadrons launched from 2 forward bases. Ground controllers issued strict lock-on procedures. Radar targeting shifted from wide sweep to fire control precision. By 0239, Soviet defenses had committed over a dozen aircraft to the intercept and positioned 3 separate missile units to engage. Then something strange happened. The bomber formation began duplicating. What had been 30 radar returns suddenly became 60. Some signals overlapped, others diverged, then reconverged. The pattern so sharp just minutes before now twisted into a mess of signals. Commanders scrambled to reclassify the targets, possibly decoys. One officer theorized, NATO may be using chaff or electronic duplication. Pilots, now within interception range, made repeated passes. They saw nothing. Radio traffic from the air was frantic. No visual. One MiG pilot reported, no contact, only radar. The targets danced across scopes, but the sky remained empty. By 0304, even as additional radar stations joined the chorus, some within the control center began to whisper the unthinkable. What if the targets aren't real, but the system still saw them? Lock-on sequences worked, ranging data returned. Radar echo strength remained strong, and so protocol pressed forward. Had the alert level been raised another tier, launch authorization for at least 1 missile battery would have been requested. Instead, a single atmospheric technician, reviewing barometric data, made a quiet observation. We're in inversion conditions. Thermal ducting is probable. He was ignored. After all, ducting doesn't create perfect bomber formation, or does it? At 0329 without warning, the phantom targets began to vanish one by one. Some blinked out, others drifted into impossibly tight spirals, a few fragmented into flickering clusters before disappearing entirely. By 0347, the sky was clean. No enemy, no bombers, no missiles fired, only silence, and a question hanging over every console. What did we just see? As the phantom targets vanished from the Western radar network, a second wave of confusion erupted, not in the field, but in Moscow. Central Air Defense Command had been monitoring the alerts in real time. Reports had poured in multiple radar confirmations, flight paths consistent with strategic bombers, interceptors scrambled, missile batteries ready. The narrative had momentum. Something had happened, and now nothing, no wreckage, no visual contact, no breach reports, no enemy response, nothing on NATO frequencies. Just clean skies and stunned silence. But Soviet doctrine did not tolerate unexplained phenomena. There had to be a cause, and Moscow demanded one. The first theory proposed enemy stealth. Perhaps the Americans had flown a new aircraft through Soviet airspace, undetectable by visual means, but still reflecting just enough radar energy to confuse detection arrays. That would explain why the radar saw something, but the MiG pilots saw nothing. A general in charge of electronic warfare even posited, "This is a test, a NATO probing action. They want us to respond, to show our cards." The logic was flawed, but the fear was real. Second theory, NATO electronic deception. Had Western forces sent up drones or reflectors? Were they bouncing radar signals off weather balloons? Had a U.S. EC-130 commando solo deployed from West Germany to jam or inject false returns? Unlikely, but not impossible. And in a system built on suspicion, not evidence, unlikely was enough to push protocol into higher gear. What Moscow refused to believe was the third possibility. The radar itself was accurate, but misled. That ducting simple atmospheric conditions had bent signals across hundreds of kilometers and back, creating ghost echoes of terrain, weather, and distant aircraft. That Soviet radar had effectively hallucinated. Admitting this would mean confronting a devastating truth. The USSR's prized air defense infrastructure, spanning from Poland to the Pacific, could be rendered blind by humidity and temperature. And worse, that the Americans might already know this. So, Moscow dismissed the meteorological explanation. Instead, reports were sanitized. The phrase false targets was replaced with unconfirmed incursions. Officer testimony from interceptor pilots was omitted. No mention of atmospheric ducting appeared in the final Central Command memo. The official conclusion. The event was likely a Western deception maneuver, and appropriate countermeasures will be implemented. Unofficially, command-level trust in radar began to erode. For the first time, Soviet generals realized they had almost fired on nothing, and their entire doctrine had no answer for that. In the days following the Phantom radar incident, while official reports deflected blame and minimized embarrassment, a new internal theory began to circulate through the Soviet military's electronic warfare community, one more sophisticated, more alarming, and entirely incorrect. They called it reflexive penetration. The theory posited that the United States had developed a next-generation radar manipulation technique, a system capable not of jamming radar, but of spoofing it remotely. According to this idea, American aircraft or ground stations had somehow exploited natural atmospheric conditions to intentionally reflect Soviet radar back at itself, creating synthetic ghost targets. These reflections weren't random. They were coordinated to mimic the radar signatures of real bombers, flying real formations, using real attack vectors. This was no accident. The theorists insisted. It was a deliberate psychological and electronic attack. Supporters pointed to how perfect the radar targets were. Clean signatures, believable spacing, precise heading toward key command zones. It all fit too well to be random. They argued that the only plausible explanation was a new American platform, perhaps a high-altitude drone or airborne command craft injecting false signals through ducting layers, tricking Soviet systems into seeing enemies that didn't exist. Some even suspected NATO's AWACS fleet, known for its powerful radar capabilities, as the culprit. Though unproven, the theory gained traction fast. Why? Because it offered a comforting illusion of control. If the radar hallucinations were caused by enemy deception, then Soviet systems weren't flawed, they were simply attacked. That meant the solution wasn't rethinking doctrine, but building better countermeasures, stronger encryption, hardened frequencies, deeper signal analysis. Blaming the Americans let Soviet engineers off the hook. It meant the radar wasn't broken. It meant the doctrine wasn't obsolete. And most importantly, it allowed the High Command to avoid the uncomfortable truth that a weather anomaly had nearly triggered a war. So, the reflexive penetration theory was quietly endorsed in internal memos. Development of anti-deception protocols accelerated. Radar technicians were retrained to scan for pattern anomalies. A new code phrase entered the Soviet Lexicon Signal Divergence Index, a bureaucratic euphemism for radar ghosts. But the irony was sharp. In trying to explain away the ghost bombers, the Soviets created a ghost threat, one they never proved, never confirmed, but spent years preparing for. They had missed the real lesson. Sometimes, your greatest vulnerability isn't the enemy's innovation. It's your own refusal to believe you were wrong. If the first misbelief had been that the Americans had faked the radar returns through external deception, the second was even more dangerous, that internal sabotage had caused the phantoms. This theory emerged not from the radar corps or the engineers, but from the political officers. After the incident, one GRU-affiliated security analyst proposed a chilling possibility. What if the radar systems weren't fooled by accident, or the enemy, but by someone within our own ranks? The phrase caught on like wildfire. Overnight, suspicion crept through the corridors of the PVO. Commanders were asked to audit personnel. Background checks were reopened. Junior technicians were interrogated over their maintenance logs. Entire radar installations were subject to sudden, unannounced inspections. Why would someone fake phantom targets? The theory went like this. An internal actor, a saboteur or sympathizer, had subtly altered radar parameters, exploiting the known susceptibility of certain frequencies during high humidity conditions. By adjusting gain settings or antenna calibrations, they could deliberately induce signal bouncing and ghost returns, all while the system reported operational normality. This would serve multiple purposes: induce panic, test Soviet chain of command reactions, erode internal confidence in the defense net, potentially spark accidental engagement with NATO. It was a narrative steeped in paranoia, but it fit the ideological mold. In a system conditioned to fear betrayal as much as invasion, the idea of internal subversion was always politically safer than admitting systemic failure. The KGB was notified. At least 2 radar officers were temporarily reassigned under disciplinary review. One was demoted. Another rumored to have spoken openly about ducting days before the incident was forced into early retirement. These moves weren't based on evidence. They were based on optics. Moscow needed a human culprit, not a cloud, by creating an internal enemy. The Soviet command preserved the illusion of control. If a saboteur had caused the phantom incursion, the solution was simple: remove the traitor, restore the system, move forward. No need to reevaluate doctrine. No need to retrain thousands. No need to admit that nature had outsmarted technology. But the real danger wasn't a man with a wrench. It was an empire convinced it could never be fooled by its own sky. It would take more than a week for the truth to break through. After the incident, amidst the growing swirl of theories, enemy spoofing, sabotage, radar defect, a few senior officers at the Military Meteorological Directorate finally pushed back. They requested full atmospheric telemetry from every radar station involved. What they found shattered the entire narrative. Temperature logs, barometric pressure, humidity levels, and thermal lapse rates all painted the same picture: a perfect storm for anomalous propagation. A strong high-pressure system over Eastern Europe had trapped a cold air layer beneath a warmer one, a classic temperature inversion. At the same time, high-altitude clouds saturated with moisture had formed near the Polish border. This inversion created an atmospheric duct, a refractive channel through which radar waves could bend, traveling hundreds of kilometers beyond their normal range and bouncing off distant terrain, plains, or cloud walls before returning as false echoes. In short, the radar hadn't failed. It had worked too well. Signals meant to travel 200 kilometers were reaching 700. The echoes they returned weren't local. They were distorted reflections of faraway mountains, civilian airliners over West Germany, or even other Soviet signals bouncing back upon themselves. The result was chaos masquerading as coherence. Targets moved like bombers. Formations appeared disciplined. But none of it was real. When these findings were delivered to Moscow, they caused internal panic, not because of the atmospheric explanation itself, but because of what it implied. The Soviets had no filter for this kind of error. American radar systems, particularly in NORAD, had long integrated meteorological compensation algorithms. U.S. operators received training in ghost return identification, signal divergence patterns, and ducting behavior. Soviet operators had none of that. Their screens showed targets. They acted accordingly. There was no doctrine for uncertainty, only response. Even worse, the Soviet intelligence services had known about atmospheric ducting. It had been mentioned in weather briefings filed under low-risk anomalies. It had simply never been considered strategically relevant until now. This was the real intelligence failure. Not a missed enemy operation, not a defect in the radar, but a failure to anticipate the most human thing of all nature doesn't care about doctrine. By refusing to believe that clouds, heat, and moisture could disrupt the logic of war, the Soviets had nearly launched missiles at ghosts, and for days afterward, the entire military system hunted enemies that didn't exist, chasing theories that only deepened the lie. The radar didn't betray them. Their belief in perfection did. While Soviet radar operators were chasing phantoms in the night, the United States had already faced and solved this problem years earlier. It began in the early 1960s, when American radar stations along the DW line in Alaska and Canada started reporting strange anomalies during periods of thermal inversion. Targets would appear hundreds of miles away, often mimicking formations of Soviet bombers that never existed. The U.S. response wasn't panic. It was protocol. American radar engineers at NORAD and the FAA recognized early on that radar, while technologically robust, was still a slave to the atmosphere. So they developed a layered strategy, not to eliminate ducting errors, but to anticipate and compensate for them. The first layer was environmental telemetry. U.S. radar sites were fitted with advanced weather monitoring stations. These didn't just track temperature and wind, they logged tropospheric refraction indexes, alerting operators when ducting conditions were likely. Second signal filtering algorithms. By the mid-1970s, U.S. radar processors could compare returns against environmental data, rejecting signals that exhibited unnatural propagation behavior. This meant ghost targets could often be flagged before they ever reached the radar screen. Third, multi-platform verification. Unlike the Soviet system, which relied heavily on radar for rapid response, American protocols demanded cross-confirmation. A blip on radar wasn't a target until it was verified via AWACS aerial surveillance, infrared satellite detection, radio intercept triangulation, visual confirmation when feasible. In essence, American doctrine trusted data, but only in context. A radar spike meant nothing without corroboration. U.S. operators were trained not just to act fast, but to think critically. Ironically, it was this skepticism that made the American system stronger. The Soviets had speed, but no second layer. Their radar systems were fast, powerful, and deadly, but vulnerable to illusions. The Americans had redundancy. In the U.S. system, the ghost fleet that spooked the Soviets would have been flagged as an atmospheric anomaly within minutes. Operators would have logged it, cross-checked it, and moved on. No intercepts, no missile alerts, no panic. This wasn't because of superior technology, it was a result of doctrinal humility. The Americans accepted that radar could lie. The Soviets didn't, and that made all the difference. The events of March 1978 revealed a brutal truth in a world governed by machines. The side that trains for error is the one most likely to survive it. The radar ghost fleet was never real, but the danger it revealed absolutely was. The incident didn't end when the phantom targets vanished. It ended when the Soviet military realized they had nearly gone to war with vapor and had no one to blame but themselves. The debriefings were brutal. Over 24 radar crews were questioned. 3 regimental commanders were formally reprimanded. One colonel was removed from his post for overreaction to unverified contact. Internal memos circulated through the Ministry of Defense labeling the event a perceptual failure of combat readiness. It was the most sterile way to say, we saw ghosts and almost fired real missiles. In Belarus, 2 SAM crews were rotated out of duty for rest, but the subtext was clear they had locked onto targets that never existed. One battery commander admitted later, I thought I was tracking death itself, and I was. But it was ours, not theirs. Among the pilot corps, humiliation ran deeper. Intercept squadrons had launched at full afterburner. They burned fuel, flew dangerous high-speed passes, executed formation spreads all based on orders fed by radar. They chased shadows. Some pilots returned so shaken they refused to speak during debrief. One report cited extreme agitation and inconsistent testimony, all because they had been asked to fight a war against an enemy they could not see. Even worse, the Americans had no idea it had happened. There was no incursion, no test, no provocation. NATO flights in the region followed routine patrols. The U.S. didn't even detect an alert posture spike from the Soviets. From the outside, it looked like a normal night. From inside, it was almost the beginning of the end. To prevent further embarrassment, Soviet High Command locked the entire incident under military classification code B451Z and labeled it a training aberration. No external review, no doctrinal change, no public acknowledgement. But the officers who lived through it knew better. They knew how close they had come to firing live ordnance based on weather and fear. They knew how fragile the truth had become when filtered through unquestioned machines and in whispered conversations between radar operators, missile crews, and pilots. A new phrase began to circulate. Don't trust the first ghost. It wasn't official. It wasn't in any manual. But it was all they had to hold on to in a system that punished doubt and had almost made doubt the only thing that saved them. The Phantom Fleet incident didn't just shake confidence, it punctured an ideology. For decades, the Soviet military complex had built its reputation on one unshakable premise that it could outdetect, outreact, and outgun any Western incursion. The PVO Soviet Air Defense Forces was its crown jewel, and radar was the eye through which it watched the world. But in a single night, that eye had lied. And the system didn't know what to do with that. Senior commanders met behind closed doors to discuss protocol revisions. Some quietly proposed adding atmospheric filters. Others suggested more extensive pilot verification or increased use of visual recon. But none of these ideas gained traction, because to admit their necessity would be to admit that the system had failed. And in the Soviet Union, systems didn't fail. People did. So the search for scapegoats continued. The equipment was declared sound. The incident was rebranded a false positive training scenario. No structural change occurred. But underneath the surface, the cracks were spreading. Younger officers who had lived through the event began to distrust their screens. Pilots requested secondary confirmation before engaging targets. Missile crews asked new questions, quiet ones about what might constitute a verified signal in future scenarios. These weren't signs of insubordination. They were signs of survival instinct. Because what had been exposed was far more dangerous than a doctrinal weakness. It was an epistemological collapse, a breakdown of how truth was measured in a system built entirely on instrumentation. If radar could hallucinate, and the machine was always obeyed, then reality itself had become negotiable. The Soviets weren't just vulnerable to enemy missiles. They were vulnerable to the sky lying to them. And worse, they had no cultural space to absorb that fact. Where the Americans trained for uncertainty, the Soviets had erased it. Where the West questioned data, the East enforced it. And so, A single night of radar echoes transformed into a strategic fault line, one that would be buried, silenced, and forgotten, until the next time the sky bent light the wrong way. The ideology didn't collapse all at once. It fractured quietly, in the minds of those who now knew that beneath all the doctrine, discipline, and steel, they had almost launched a war because a cloud told them to. Years later, in a declassified transcript from a radar officer stationed near Kaliningrad, a single sentence stood out. They weren't targets. They were echoes pretending to be targets. But we were trained to kill the echo, not question it. That sentence would never appear in any Soviet manual. But it told the truth of that night better than any classified report ever could. The Ghost Fleet of March 1978 never existed. No bombers, no missiles, no war. And yet it shaped policy, triggered alarms, nearly started real combat, and exposed a military machine built on certainty in a world ruled by chaos. What should have been a technical footnote became a strategic mirror. It showed how vulnerable even the most powerful defense system could be, not to an enemy, but to its own blind spots, and how fragile peace can become when interpretation is replaced with automation. This wasn't just a Cold War glitch. It was a warning one that still echoes in today's age of sensors, AI targeting, and automated defense networks, because the next war may not begin with an invasion. It may begin with a blip on a screen. If you found this episode as haunting as we did, if you believe these forgotten Cold War moments hold lessons for the future, subscribe to our channel. Each day, we bring you real stories of near misses, hidden conflicts, and the razor's edge between peace and catastrophe. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, stay informed, because history doesn't always repeat itself. But when it echoes, it can still kill.